Okay, in the last lesson, we really kind of talked about the first opening shots of the Civil War. Remember, Lincoln has been elected as President of the United States. South Carolina has started to succeed, and they have, and they're joined by several other states. And April 12th, on 1861, they bombard Fort Sumter, and the war's begun, all right? So let's talk about this. Now, both sides feel that this is going to be a quick war. In fact, Abraham Lincoln has called for 75,000 troops for 90 days. That's it, because they think that they're going to be able to crush the Confederacy pretty easily. Well, the South thinks the same thing, that this is going to be a pretty quick conflict. All right? So today, what we're going to talk about is the conflicts, or the things that are really the country is talking about, what is really dividing them. All right? So what issues divide the nation? What are the primary strengths and weaknesses? We're going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of both the North and the South. And believe it or not, both of them have strengths and both of them have weaknesses. And we're going to be introduced to some of the leaders from each side of the war. All right? So let's get started. Okay, when this war begins, both sides think they're right. The South absolutely feels that they should have the right to leave this union. They look at it as almost like a club. They've joined a club and they don't like what's going on, so they're going to leave. They see this sort of as, like the Second Revolutionary War. They're fighting for their independence. They're fighting for their way of life. They're fighting to defend their institutions, including slavery. Okay? Now, the North feels that the South should not be able to leave, that this is one nation, right? And, at first, honestly, this isn't about slavery. When this war begins, honest to goodness, guys, for the North perspective, it's not about slavery. They're fighting to defend the Union, to preserve the Union. In fact, there's many people in the North that actually support the institution of slavery. We've really kind of focused on the abolitionists in the previous lesson, and I hope I haven't given you the idea that everybody in the North is an abolitionist, because they certainly are not. Even Lincoln himself doesn't really appear to be an abolitionist. He's a free soiler. He just doesn't want slavery to expand. So you need to know that when this war begins, the Civil War begins, this is about preserving the Union for the North. Okay? Hey, by the way, a couple things I just want to point out. We've added to our territory. Now, here's the Colorado territory. Kansas now is a state. So here's Kansas. Kansas is a state. Colorado territory has been added. The Dakota territory has been carved out of that northern part. And Nebraska, but look how big the Panhandle. We still have some mountains. Man, I wish we'd kind of kept that. That's present-day Wyoming, of course. All right? So there you have it. Okay, let's look at the northern strengths. Now, obviously, they have a large population. They have 22 million people. 22 million people. So they have a large population, so they can support the military, say they have enough men to fight in the military, and still to produce food and also manufacture. Okay, most of the nation's factories are in the North. We've talked about that for quite some time. They produce more than 90% of the nation's manufactured goods. Right? So the North has a large population. They have plenty of people to fight in the war. They have plenty of people still work the farms. They have still plenty of people to work in the factories. A lot of that is because of that immigration flood in the 1840s, 1850s. And finally, they have a very strong Navy. Large fleet of merchant ships and a large Navy. So they're going to be able to have warships to carry on battle, and they still have merchant ships that they can still go get and trade and still produce income for our country and bring in things that we need. Okay? But the North has weaknesses. Okay? The North has to conquer a huge area. All right? So not only they're not protecting their border necessarily. The threat of the South invading them isn't so great. But they have to go and they have to conquer the land in the South, which means every time they have a battle, they have to leave men behind to hold those positions. So you attack, say you have 10,000 men, you lose 500 in battle, you capture the city or the fort. Well, you just can't abandon it. You still have to leave maybe another 500 or 1,000 people behind. So now your force of 10,000 has been whittled down, by 1,500 to 2,000. You do that a couple times, and your army is effectively gone. All right? So they have to conquer a huge area. They're invading unfamiliar land. They don't know where the roads are. They don't know where these swamps lead, who's hiding behind that next turn. So it's unfamiliar land. Plus, just like the British in the Revolutionary War, they have a very long supply line. And the longer your supply line is, the more vulnerable it is. All right? So the North does have some weaknesses. Now let's look at the strengths and weaknesses of the South. All right, Southern strengths. Now, guys, they have a strong reason to fight. I mean, they're defending their homes. They're defending their way of life, right? Now, if your house was being attacked, your house, you would fight a whole lot more, right? A lot stronger than if you were, fighting to defend somebody else's house. So if you're defending your home, your state, maybe your own farm even, you're going to fight much harder, all right? The Southern soldier also knows the countryside. They live there. They know where that swamp leads. They know where that path leads. They know where the hiding places are, all right? So they know the lay of the land. The civilians in the South are certainly going to help them. They're going to say, hey, man, I just heard a Yankee force is coming up, or they're going to provide food. They're going to do everything that they can to help the Southern fighting man. And this last one certainly cannot be overstated, all right? They have strong military leadership, very strong military leadership. Some of the best generals, I would say arguably almost all the really good generals, especially in the beginning of the war, are fighting for the South. And remember, it's kind of that tradition of the cottonocracy where their young men are going to be sent to military academies, West Point, VMI, the Citadel. They believe that their men of the cottonocracy, or certainly the strong upper middle class, are going to receive military training. So they have very strong military leadership. Southern weaknesses, of course. And by the way, guys, the South isn't blind going into this. They know their weaknesses. They know they have few factories to produce weapons and goods. They have very few railroads to move troops and supplies. And the ones that they do have, by the way, usually just go from point to point, from A to B. They don't really even connect up to a network. Their central government is really screwed up. They believe in strong states' rights, don't they? Well, that's going to hamper the ability of the federal government, the confederacies, to do anything. You're going to see where they can't agree on almost anything. The federal government of the Confederacy is hamstrung by this idea of strong state governments. In fact, the book even mentions that Georgia's governor would not let Georgians fight under anybody except for a Georgian general. Well, that's going to be tough to do. How you manage a military when you have the governors trying to tell you how to run the war. They have a very small population. They have 9 million people in the South, but a third of them are slaves. Remember that? So you're down to about 6 million. So they don't have enough people to support the war effort, and they have very few ships. Now, what is the one thing the South has? They have cotton. And Great Britain needs cotton. And so does France. So what they really believe is going to happen is that they're going to be able to hold out to fight this kind of defensive war, to drag it out, and eventually Great Britain and France are going to recognize them as an independent country and maybe even send them supplies and possibly even the Navy, the British Navy, to break up the blockade that the Union is going to do. Okay? So that's the strengths and weaknesses of the South. All right. So this is even a better graphic. Look at this. The blue obviously is northern resources. The gray is southern resources. Okay, total population. So 70% of the total population lives in the north. Look at the factory production. 91% of everything that's produced is being produced in the north. Look at the railroads. 71% of all the tracks lay in the north. Farmland is the shocker, though. 75% of the nation's farmland is in the north. What? That's right, guys. Remember, the South has got the cotton belt, and they've got some sugar cane and rice plantations, But really, a lot of that is hilly, of the Appalachians, or swamps. So actually, 75% of the nation's farmland is in the north. And in the north, they're actually growing food. They're not growing cotton. They're growing wheat and barley and corn. Food. All right? So look at that. Let's talk about that. The one thing that the South has on the north, of course, is cotton production. 96% of all the cotton that is grown in the United States is grown in the southern states. All right? So just by looking at this, you can tell, or should think, my gosh, this is going to be a quick war. The North has got this huge, overwhelming advantage in almost everything. Population, factories, railroads, farms. But this war is going to last for 4 years. All right? So let's look at the leaders of the North. Okay. The leaders of this war. All right. So the Confederate president is Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, as I've said before, really, on paper, looks like he is going to be the better leader. He attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He'd been an officer in the Mexican War. He's been the Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. And he's been respected for his honesty and courage. Okay? He has a lot of experience. He has a lot of leadership roles. But he's not going to do very well. Part of it is the fact that, he is hamstrung. Remember I told you in the previous slide that the Southern government, the Confederate government, is very weak. The federal government of the Confederacy is extremely weak because, remember, many of these states are believing in strong states' rights, and they certainly are not going to let any federal government, tell the states what to do. So he is going to be limited on what he can actually do as a leader. Now, Abraham Lincoln, okay? Again, just by looking at his resume, you're not going to think much about Abraham Lincoln. Did not have much experience in national politics, right? He served as a congressman. He had lost in 1858 to Stephen Douglas as senator, so he's never been a senator. He'd never been in the military, so he didn't have any military experience. But he turns out to be a strong leader. He spends hours studying war plans. He checks out books. He reads everything he can. He asks questions. He craves knowledge. He tries to learn, and he does. Also, a very strong characteristic and a good characteristic he has a sense of humor. Through all of this hardship and crisis, he still has a sense of humor. And finally, he can accept criticism. And man, is he going to get it. He is going to get it from all sides. He's going to get it from his cabinet. He's going to get it from the military leaders. He's going to get it from the population. But he has a strong sense of humor, and he can accept criticism. And those two key characteristics are really going to carry him far. And I think also, guys, he knows what he's doing is right. He firmly believes what he is doing is right. So he won't be swayed. He knows what he's doing. Finally, you have to look at probably the greatest general America has produced, at least one of them, and that is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee had attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He had graduated second in his class. He had never received a demerit. In other words, he had never done anything, never had to be disciplined. He was self-disciplined. He is from Virginia, okay? He had done well in the Mexican War. By the way, when he graduated from West Point, he is selected to the engineering department, so the Corps of Engineers. He is a master of building fortifications and looking at the battlefield, knowing where the advantages are, and he's going to use those quite a bit. When this war breaks out, remember, Virginia hasn't joined the Confederacy right when the war breaks out. And Lincoln says, who is the guy? Who should I get to be the commander? And almost without exception, everybody says Robert E. Lee. So Lincoln actually offers him the command of the entire Union Army. By the way, his home is right across from Washington, D.C. He lives in Arlington House. He can probably see the Capitol and the White House from his own home. So it's right across the river, right across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. Lee says, thank you very much. Let me think about it. He goes home. He goes, I cannot do this. I have to be loyal to my state. Remember, again, he does not see himself as an American. He sees himself as Virginian. And almost everybody back then were loyal to their states, especially in the South. All right? So unfortunately, he turns down Lincoln's offer, and he remains loyal to Virginia, where he's going to go on to be the commander of all the Confederate forces. All right? I would guess that if Lee had been the commander of the Union forces, this war would have been much, much shorter. All right? So there you go. Some of the reasons, some of the things that separates the North and the South, and strengths and weaknesses, and a few of the military leaders. Okay? Next lesson, we're going to start actually looking at some of the battles.